Well, awesome. I'm so excited that you guys are having a good day so far here. I'm really excited to be able to present with Keith. So Keith, stick your hand up there so everybody, all right. Keith and I are gonna tag team this session, which is why we called it the 1-2 punch, because we thought it'd be kind of nice to, both of us get up here. We're not gonna punch anyone, so don't worry about that. But what we are gonna do is we're gonna take a look at kind of taking your career up a notch, but from two different perspectives, right? I'm gonna spend a few minutes talking about it from a technical perspective, but I wanna be very, very clear and let you know that it's for IT professionals, and Keith, you let me know, I think you agree here. For IT professionals, it is increasingly becoming not only about the technology, it is becoming also about how you tie it to the business.
Absolutely.
You agree with that? Okay. Hey guys, can you make him live too? Because he may be chiming in while I'm talking. Okay, there you go. Thank you. So, it's fine and great to look at technologies from a technical perspective, and it's important that we, as technologists, that we understand where these things fit and if they fit into what we're trying to accomplish. But it is just as important that we look at this from a business perspective, because in the end, what we do as technologists is really all about enabling the businesses to do what they're trying to do, right? Unless you work for a software company, the software and the stuff that we do, that is not the end goal. The end goal is what it is we're trying to accomplish. Making widgets, or serving customers, or whatever the case may be. Right? So, just want to kind of preface that real quick. Again, my name's Scott Lowe. I gave an introduction this morning in the keynote, so a lot of that's repetitive. Yeah, blah, blah. Okay, great. Once again, I'll reiterate, please contribute. We do have prizes to give away somewhere in here. Do you know where
They're somewhere.
They're
We
somewhere.
have them.
We will figure that out. Okay.
But we have them there.
We have somewhere to give away. So interaction is encouraged. Feel free to ask questions, provide feedback, share your experience or your viewpoint, right? Once again, feel free to participate socially, take pictures, post tweets, Facebook updates, Instagram photos, Snapchat, whatever float your boat. The hashtag hashtag SydneyVMUG or @VMUGSydney if you're using Twitter. And again, out of courtesy for others, please do silence your mobile devices, although you're more than welcome to continue to use them while we are going.
What if I take photos?
What if you take photos? Yeah, sure, that's fine. Yeah, no worries. If the shutter noise gets too loud, we'll let you know. So, all right. So with that, who in here is being asked to do less with more? No, read it carefully. Who in here is being asked to do less with more? One person. Okay, you and I are going to talk later. No, see, the reality is we're not being asked to do less with more. Our companies do not come to us and say, I know the IT budget was kind of tight last year, so this coming year we're going to double that for you. And I know high IT headcount was a little slick, so just go hire a bunch of people. Don't worry about the headcount. It doesn't matter, right? And you've been working a lot of hours, so just don't worry about that. We're going to cut that back to 35 hours a week. That's not happening, right? I mean, it's not happening.
Can I join that company?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying, right? That sounds great, but it's just not happening. The reality is that it's the flip side. We're being asked to do more with less. We're asked to be more efficient, more effective, right? To deliver results more quickly and to deliver more results than what we were delivering already. That's the nature of how the industry is moving. And as a result, in order for us to continue to remain effective and relevant in this industry, we have to evolve along with the demands of the industry, right? And so what I'm going to do in the first part of this section, or the first section of this presentation rather, is look at what I believe would be relevant for you as a technologist, from a technical perspective, to pay attention to, okay? And then I'm going to hand it off to Keith in a few minutes, and he's going to share perspectives around that from a business perspective, right? Because again, this isn't just about the technology; it's also about the business. And so I want you guys to really note that, like, okay, I'm going to be talking technology, but this is not the end of the discussion. It's barely the beginning of the discussion. So, the key thing for these technologies, as I launch into them, right, is that the real value for us as IT professionals is about moving higher in the stack, right? It's about efficiency, it's about consistency, it's about adding value to your business. And doing repetitive tasks doesn't add value. Like, anybody can click buttons. Anybody can be taught to type commands. Okay? That's not where the value really lies for your business. The value realizing for business is how can you help your business use these technologies to become or to be faster in the market, more cost effective than their competitors, offering more value to customers than other companies in the same market space. Okay? So as I talk about these technologies, it's not just because, there's a lot of hype. Usually there's a kernel of truth in all the hype. Right? It just takes us some time to clear all the hype away before we begin to realize what that kernel of truth is and how we can really apply that kernel of truth. Okay, so I've picked out, I don't know, 3 or 4, I don't remember how many, key technology areas that I want to talk about real quick. Okay? So first, containers and container orchestration tools. I mentioned these in the keynote. Okay, it's not just Docker. I want you guys to understand, when we talk about containers, Docker is the darling of the container world right now. But there are alternatives, and these alternatives function differently than Docker. So when somebody says to you, hey, you should be using containers, first of all, take a step back and say, okay, what are they trying to tell me? Do they really know what they're talking about, or are they blowing smoke? Right? And second, what form of container technology makes the most sense for me? Docker behaves very differently than, say, an LXC. And if you don't know or understand those differences, then you may not recognize that LXC may be more applicable in your environment than Docker might be, or vice versa. Okay? And we also have RKT, aka Rocket from CoreOS, or if you're a Windows shop, we're talking about Windows containers and Hyper-V containers. Okay? Which will be showing up, last I heard, in Server 2016. Okay, so those may also be applicable to you. It's about finding out what the right idea is. And there's also, in addition to containers, there's also all these container orchestration tools. And if you're in the Docker world, okay, again, recognizing that's just one subset of the container world, that we have Docker Swarm, Docker Machine, Docker Compose, which help you with clustering Docker engines, with managing virtual machines to run Docker engines on, and to orchestrate multi-container applications, which is what Docker Compose is about, respectively. Question here. Okay, so the question was around Mesos and the commercial variation of Mesos, Mesosphere. I didn't include Mesos because although Mesos is heavily associated with container orchestration, it's really more of a scheduler than anything else, right? And the frameworks on top of Mesos are what you would use to then apply workloads. So you could be using Mesos to schedule virtual machines, or you could be using Mesos to schedule bare metal workloads, or you could be using Mesos to schedule containers on the underlying resource. It's a resource manager and resource scheduler. That being said, yes, it is getting increasing traction, and you see it used heavily. The problem I have with Mesos is that Mesos is still really, really early, like 0.17 or 0.20 in the release. And as such, there are still a lot of places where you can get cut. Kubernetes, Docker are becoming more mature, especially in the enterprise space. There are some very high-profile companies that are using Mesos, Twitter, for example, Apple, for example. But those are more of the do-it-your-own environments rather than companies that are more interested in kind of, what am I doing here? That being said, I do see Mesos becoming increasingly kind of ubiquitous as we move forward. When you look at Mesos, you would see Mesos as something of a counterpart to what we're doing with Photon Platform. Okay? Does that make sense? Competitive in some respects, complementary in other respects. If you haven't had a chance to look at Photon Platform, I encourage you to do so. Photon Platform is very, very interesting. And so we have these container orchestration tools. Mesos is potentially one. It's still early days, but also the Docker ecosystem, and then also Kubernetes, which came out of Google and Google's experience building their platforms, their internal platforms, Borg and others. They use containers extensively internally, on the order of spinning up and destroying approximately 2 billion containers every week, right? But again, that's Google, and not everybody is Google. So, just keep that in mind. Try not to be blinded by the web scale. Oh, they're using this, right? Let's focus on what is the right tool for what you're trying to accomplish, right? With that in mind, I think that these particular technologies can offer, technically, can offer benefits to your organization in the right use case. Okay, it's not going to be every organization. It's not going to be every use case, but there are use cases. There are organizations where this makes a lot of sense. All right, so the reason I'm suggesting this, and the reason I suggest all these others, is How are you going to be able to tell whether this is the right technology for your use case in your organization if you don't know anything about it? Okay? If nothing else, I advise you to take a look at these technologies simply to determine, does it make sense for my organization? And then I can speak intelligently when the CEO says, we should be using Docker. Why did he say that or she say that? Because they heard it somewhere at some trade show. You can say, I've already looked at it, I've already evaluated it, here are the potential use cases we explored, here's why it made sense, here's why it didn't. Any further questions? If the CEO then still says, we need to use Docker, okay. You've done your job, due diligence done on your part, right? Then you do what you're told. All right, so moving on. Public cloud providers. Okay, we mentioned how VMware is moving NSX into public clouds in the keynote, but this is again one of these scenarios where public clouds can be a useful tool in your tool belt. Okay, and increasingly IT, it's less about saying no, you can't do that. We don't want to be those guys that put the no in innovation. Okay, think about that, you'll get it. But we want to be the broker that helps them find the right service and the right tool to get the job done. Because if you don't do that, they will go find somebody who will, aka Shadow IT. Okay? So, Amazon Web Services, Azure, Google Cloud Engine. I don't want you to think about this being all or none. I'm not advocating that you should move everything out to the public cloud, nor am I advocating that nothing should be public cloud and everything should be on premises. Okay? I'm saying that not all workloads are suited, but some are, and it's about you guys knowing these platforms and knowing their advantages and disadvantages well enough to be able to choose the right tool for the job. There may be instances, actually I would probably go so far as to say there will be instances in many organizations where running applications on the public cloud makes a lot of sense. Okay? Depending on your security requirements, depending on your governance, depending on the workload itself, depending on cost structures, those kind of things, depending on the application. Okay? There are also going to be, for many organizations, places where running public cloud does not make sense. And on-premises, vSphere infrastructure, something of that nature, makes a lot of sense. Okay? All right, automation and orchestration. Couple key examples here. Scripting languages, configuration management tools. Okay? I give you Windows and Linux examples. I'm a Linux guy myself, but a lot of us out there running Windows. So if you aren't taking the time to look at PowerShell and PowerCLI or PowerShell DSC on the Windows side, you are cheating yourself, right? Because there is no value to your organization in doing the same things over and over and over again, right? There's no value to the business in manually building a web server when you could build a PowerShell desired state configuration description of what that needs to look like and write it once and then apply it many times, right? Automation is a force multiplier. Okay? If you want to be more forceful in the kind of work you're doing, you need automation to help you do that. So you are cheating yourself, you're doing yourself a disadvantage if you're not taking some time to become more familiar with automation orchestration tools, right? Same if on the Linux side, if you're not looking at scripting languages like Python and Bash, and you're not working with configuration management tools like Ansible, Chef, Puppet, or Salt, right? You are cheating yourself. There's no reason to be editing configuration files and doing the same things over and over and over again, right? Write a template, do it once, reap the benefits for many years to come. Okay? Yes, question about it. That's a good question. This question was, kind of what do we recommend and where to get started? What's on the slide is where I recommend you get started. Because I knew somebody would ask that, and that's actually why I put these up here. If you're in the Linux world, Python is becoming ubiquitous, right? Major open source projects like OpenStack are written entirely in Python, right? Lots and lots of some of the configuration management tools like Ansible, written in Python. Okay, Salt, I believe, written mostly in Python. So these sort of tools are becoming very ubiquitous in the Linux world. By the same token, on the Windows side, PowerShell and PowerCLI for VMware is becoming the ubiquitous scripting language on the Windows platform. Right? Microsoft with their common, what did they call it a couple years ago? Common engineering framework, I believe is what they called it, where they required that every major product have PowerShell support in it. Right? Did wonders for making sure that PowerShell is ubiquitous on the Windows platform. So that's where I recommend you start. And really it's a matter of like, do you spend most of your time in Windows, or do you spend most of your time in Linux? Then go from there, right? I spend most of my time in Linux, so I haven't done as well in the Python world, but I started out with Puppet, switched to Ansible a little while back, and I'm working on my Bash and my Python now. So, good question. Other questions? Sorry, you don't get a Chromecast.
No.
That's because he works for VMware, so. Okay, great question. All right, I didn't have a title slide for that. That's an error. I'll have to fix before I do this again in Melbourne. Cloud management and cloud orchestration platforms, right? Why do we talk about private cloud and public cloud for that matter? What is the reason behind this? And I'm going to wrap up here in just a minute and give Keith time to get up here, right? It's because it's about efficiency. It's about speed. It's about making it easy for users to consume the resources, right? I will use this thing again. You don't want to be the IT department that's saying no to every request that comes in from your users, right? Because that's only going to frustrate them. It's only going to make them go around you. So my wife beats this over my head all the time. She has done wonders for my people skills, which still have a long, long way to go, right? But from a story early in my career, this lady came up to me. I was an IT manager at a training company. She came up to me and she asked me, hey, Scott, I need to do blah, 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 whatever it was. Now, we as IT guys and gals, we all have this thing. How many of you guys remember Terminator movie, right? And he's in that apartment and he's like cutting flesh off of himself because he got hurt or something. And the lady knocks on the door, she says something, and then this menu comes up and it's like, he does this internal calculation and then he says something foul to her, right? Which I won't repeat. We all have that sort of internal decision tree going on. And now you guys are going to laugh, but it happens. Somebody comes to you from the business and says, hey, I need to do blah, blah. And in your head, you're like, no. Why? Because you've calculated, is this possible? Can we do this? What does it take? And you come to the decision, no, you can't do that. Right? Now, that's wrong. Because what we need to be saying is, when we do that little decision tree, what will it take to make this happen? And then instead of saying no, because we don't have that yet, turn around to that person and say, yes, and here's what it'll take to make it happen. And then they get to decide, is that worth it to them? Right? Like when the CEO comes and says, hey, can we write a mobile app to do this? And you're thinking, heck no, we can't because we don't have enough servers, we don't have enough people, we don't have the developers, and you say, yes, we can. We just need to hire by blah, 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 and then we can do that. And off the top of my head, $2 million to do that. Then the CEO can decide, is that worth it or is it not? And he or she can say, forget it, it's too expensive. But instead of you just saying no, because you knew that he was or she was going to say it was too expensive, right? The decision's theirs. So you say yes, and here's what it takes to make it work, right? So there you go. And so that's why we talk about cloud. And that's why cloud management, cloud orchestration platforms are important, right? From the VMware space, we have two kind of major options, vRealize Orchestrator, that's not vRealize Orchestrator, vRealize Automation, getting all my vRealize names mixed up, or OpenStack, either the full open source version or VIO. Both platforms have their strengths and weaknesses. They both have advantages and disadvantages. Again, for you guys, it's understanding what those are and then choosing the right tool for the job you're trying to accomplish. Okay? It's not about saying one is better or worse than the other. They each have their strengths. They each have their weaknesses. In some use cases, the strengths of vRealize Automation might make it more sense. In some use cases, OpenStack might make more sense. Okay? So, that's all fine and well and good, right? From a technical perspective. But now we need to look at it from a business perspective. And so I'm going to invite Keith to come up, and we're going to switch decks. Okay, there. Okay, here you are, sir.
All
and then
right.
he's going to talk about it from a business perspective.
So Scott is a Mac guy. I own a Mac, so I could do Keynote. I did Keynote, but I could not figure out how to change the aspect ratio of the slide. So I apologize. And this is probably an indication of where my career has come. I'll talk about this a little bit because this is a topic I really enjoy. To give a little background about myself, I blog a lot. I'm not quite as prolific as a lot of the other people out there, but I've posted maybe about 500 or 600 blog posts over the past 5 years. So there's a little bit of content out there. From a career perspective, I like to consider myself a geek, but the fact that I couldn't do the whole landscape thing probably proves where I've come to this point in my career. The past few years, I've spent a lot of time working at a higher level than when you talk about moving up the stack. I've moved up the stack. A couple of years ago, I was with an American security company that provided security services to the U.S. government. Lockheed Martin, you might have heard of it. I was a program architect on that, and that kind of removed me from the day-to-day data center and doing what we all love to do, which is the technology piece. After that, I spent about 2 years with PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, formerly known as, in which I spent a lot of time getting into not arguments over whether or not we should use iSCSI, NFS, or Fiber Channel, but whether or not we should lay off the IT staff and outsource to a managed service provider. So completely different and very frustrating look. When you've done this stuff day to day, it's a different perspective. So a little bit of background. I'll share a little bit more about myself at the afternoon keynote. Just to prove to you that slide decks are never ever done. These are very recent pictures. So obviously Scott from this morning's session, last night's sunset over at Manly, and then my run this morning through Hyde Park. I'm really enjoying Sydney. Thanks for having me here. One of the things that I really enjoyed about Scott's technical piece was the overall theme, if you've noticed, is cloud native. It's this concept that we're no longer doing things in this what some vendors call three-tier app perspective, where it's all focused on that hardware abstracting. We're managing pets instead of cattle is the term that I've heard some people use. The business at the end of the day wants agility and scale. How can we outlast or move quicker than our competitors? I work for a pharmaceutical in Chicago. I was happy to see when we landed, there was a big AbbVie building on the highway end, and I work for their parent company, AbbVie in the US. And one of our constant challenges from a resource and research perspective is, how do we move faster? Even though our research arm uses pets, they spin up VMs, install traditional stacks on them, spin down the VMs, and throw them away. They're not using some API to do this. They're not building cloud native apps. But the reason why we're choosing platforms such as AWS, Azure Cloud, and Google Compute is because we can do it quickly. You can spin up a pet quickly. There is no interaction with IT. There is no 2-week period in which we have to collect requirements to see what size VM you need. We need to go through IP asset management to acquire an IP address, make network firewall changes, et cetera, and then 30 days or 45 days later, we have a VM. We have to learn how to be agile and scale. So these are the drivers around cloud native. Scott might have mentioned that, the term Docker. I'd like to know how many people here are actually running containers in production? Yeah, that's pretty much that. I get that reaction most of the time. However, how many people are saying that you're not delivering services fast enough? Everyone has that challenge. And this is what we're going to talk about, the value to the business. So, over on techrepublic.com, I wrote an interesting blog post last week, because the week before, Netflix released a really great blog post that talked about their journey to the cloud. Specifically, their journey for moving all of their streaming services to the cloud. This is a little bit of a surprise. Netflix has been the poster child for like AWS. When people talk about what does cloud and cloud native look, one of the companies that we hold up as an example is Netflix. Netflix uses, when AWS goes down, we most definitely hear one of the big companies that got impacted was Netflix. Netflix is at some point, I think 37% of the internet traffic at peak was the last stat that I saw back in May of 2015. Their cloud migration, I think, is a great example of the challenges and the benefits that organizations face when they talk about cloud native. By the way, I love to talk, so if you don't interrupt me, I'll blow right past lunch, so keep that in mind. So from a business perspective, when I was today I'm a SAP infrastructure architect. I don't even have what they call an A account. I don't even have administrative rights to a server anymore. If someone saw me, I've never even seen our data center. We built a new data center, I think, last year. I've never been in it. I'm a technologist who has impact in a very different way. My conversations are normally with vice presidents, directors, talking about stuff like, and this is a plug for the afternoon session. If we're going to implement SAP HANA, what are the business advantages we're trying to achieve? And how does that best look from an IT delivery service perspective? Do we go with an SAP HANA appliance? Do we go with hyperconverged? Do we go with bring your own with a tailored data center integration, which is SAP's term for bring your own data center infrastructure? I couldn't tell you the first of what a Nutanix interface looks like. I've never done the VMware Realize what they call the cloud credit, where you go through and you learn how to deploy this stuff. However, I think the US term, and I think it translates, I'm the jerk that goes to these things and influences the decision makers. And you're like, you told them you can do what? I'm that guy, because the conversations that I have are around these, I think, core tenets. Netflix saw these 4, I think, advantages from their environment. They saw an increase in scale, an increase in uptime, an increase in agility, and the bottom one, which is a side benefit of their project, cost benefits. You notice that I didn't put cost at the front, and the original drivers, the previous slide, I didn't mention, I had a little asterisk, I didn't mention cost as a primary driver. I've done enough of these financial assessments to get to the point where unless you're cutting services, you're not cutting cost. I'm jaded at this point. You're not going to provide the same level of service at a reduced cost, or better service at a reduced cost. When I have conversations with executives, I think that's the protection of the value add to the real engineers. Is, you know what, if you're going to cut budget, then I'm going to cut capability. It's simple math. If you're going to do hyperconverged versus, and we'll get into this afternoon, if you're going to do hyperconverged versus BYOD or versus converged, at the end of the day, you're moving money, you're just moving piles of money from one category to another one. You're not going to save money. What you will do in this cloud native type of atmosphere, you're going to add things such as scale. So Netflix now has the ability to lean on AWS to provide what looks like to them infinite scale. They no longer have to design for peak from their private data center perspective. From a private data center perspective, they can do minimum services. As they need to scale, they have re-architect or redesigned their applications to automatically scale. From an uptime perspective, uptime is a challenge. I think even in a private data center, achieving 3, 4, 5 nines, if you've had to work in that type of environment, it's tough. It is really, really hard. And one of the points that Scott had on his slide deck was one of the ones that I really appreciate, because we can forget it sometimes, and that's change management, configuration management. Why do we emphasize things like Ansible? Why is that important? Well, if you remember, I know Netflix isn't as big here, but if you remember 3 or 4 years ago, Christmas Eve 2012, Netflix had a big outage. Christmas Eve, people have their streaming boxes, they can't get onto Netflix. It wasn't a problem with Netflix's application directly. It was a regular change that Amazon implemented in their elastic load balancers. So that had a cascading effect onto Netflix's application, and their application eventually went down. When you move to the cloud, those are the unknown kind of gotchas from the configuration management perspective. Who knew in today's organization, when all your IT is internal, our change management is mature enough to know that if there's going to be a change to load balancers, we have a technical review board that reviews, or a CAB that reviews those changes. Before those changes are made, people get to weigh in and say, no, that's going to have this cascading effect. Maybe we could have caught that, maybe we couldn't. But the point is, that adds value to the business. When you as a technologist can look up, raise your hand and say, you know what? Amazon does this thing, and this thing would have a bad impact and have bad downtime impacts to us, that I think adds value. The agility through elasticity. I can't underemphasize the importance of elasticity when it comes to adding business value. Most of us don't have infinite budgets, unless you work for a government that's spying on us, on their citizens. You don't have an infinite budget. You have to be able to move quickly, scale up, and sometimes scale down. We forget the whole scale down piece. So, designing for peak is nice if you have the budget, but what happens when you exceed peak? And what happens if you need to scale back and recoup some of that investment? This is where Netflix, I think, caught a side benefit of cost reduction. Because they no longer have to design for peak, they can now save money on overall data center costs. According to Netflix's blog, they now spend a fraction of the amount that they spent on data center services because of the elasticity of the application. So this goes back, I think, again, to some of Scott's earlier points about the tools that we use. We can't create elasticity if we have to take the CD, put it into, this is the last time I installed a server, by the way. Take a CD, put it into a server, run through the installation process, and this could be ESXi, it doesn't matter. That, unless we automate these things and be able to automatically contract and grow these things without human interaction, we're not adding benefit or value to the business. They can easily go out to AWS, Azure, Google, and get these services without us. So we have to adapt to the changes of the culture. So why, I think, is this important? From a person who has to be in the day-to-day trenches, figuring out why the ESXi server won't boot, or why vMotion isn't working between two hosts, one that I recently upgraded. If that's your day-to-day job, how do I look beyond that and see the clear picture? I want to, I think, add some sobriety to it. One, we talked about Docker and how many people are using Docker, and we also talked about how many people have the challenge of the business wanting services, existing services, faster. I think the reality of it is that I call it clouding is hard. It took Netflix 7 years to get out of their private data center. If you read some of the stuff that these guys write, they wrote this Chaos Monkey thing that they offered to us to open source. If you go in and look at the code, I did, as if I could understand it, but I looked at it. This is some great stuff. You look at it like, wow, these guys are really smart. The really smart guys have a hard time at this, which tells me personally, I have to work harder. In jest, I say that I haven't installed the server in production. That's true, but I have a beefy home lab. If you guys follow me on Twitter and on the Virtualized Geek channel, you notice, my most recent lab was trying to install Microsoft Azure Cloud. That I get into the nuggets. You have to expand and get into those technical things because it adds value. We talked about the need to expand your vision beyond your own data centers. I think one of the great examples is the Netflix outage with the elastic load balancers. That's hard enough to capture when you're in your own data center. When you expand beyond your data center and you start to aggregate data centers, Scott talked about, in his NSX session, he talked about moving services from Amazon to Azure and to Google Compute. Well, that's 3 different external change management programs you have to now monitor and understand the impact to your environment. I think that's a key area that you need to build up skills and offer value to the enterprise. So if you're in a position and someone comes to you and says, you know what, Keith, we want to implement cloud. These are some of the conversations you need to have. Is beyond the, okay, how do we install a server on AWS? You know what, I can get anybody to do that. I can write a Python script that installs a server on AWS. There's a JSON that allows me to do it today. There's an API, and I have end users that can do that. That doesn't add value. You have to move higher up the stack. And an example of this is in change management. We all, at times, hate change management, but I'm a big proponent of this is where you add value higher up the stack. Being able to look at the entire distributed system, because we're all engineers and we love distributed systems, and cloud native is an opportunity for much more complex distributed systems. Our vision just becomes a little bit different. Instead of working on a contained system that we have complete control of, now we're working on a much larger distributed system with challenges that we no longer consider because our organizations have built up the talent internally to manage that. Now, this part I can't control, but I think it's a great bullet point. As we move up the stack, the compensation changes. One of the things that we learned from the next Netflix journey and from Netflix in general, and there's a side, I think, impact to this as well, is that the average Netflix employee, not the average Netflix engineer, the average Netflix employee makes $180,000 a year in USD. That's a big number. And if you think about it, the more talented you are, the more value you add to the business. Economics tells us the more you're compensated. That's a double-edged sword. I think the future of work, this is just Keith thinking, is going to be a lot like the Netflix model. Just like we'll adapt and take the Netflix technology approach, we'll also take their approach to work. We are going to constantly move higher up the stack. Netflix has this, I don't know if you want to call it notorious, but it is most definitely famous approach to work. You have a finite job responsibility, job responsibility, you have a finite delivery. You need to deliver something. Let's say it's automation. You want to automate the building and tearing down of systems for streaming as demand expands and contracts. In your role, you finish that job, and in the US we call it a W-2 employee, so a full-time employee. After that job is done, you no longer have a job at Netflix. You have a great byline on your resume, and you can go out and get another job doing something great. You can go out and do something else great, but your career at Netflix is over. You trade the day-to-day minutia for something a little bit more exciting, but you also sacrifice some stability, and this is just me and my opinion. But throughout my career, I talked about it at the beginning, that as a consultant, while the storage guys, and I can pick on storage guys because we're mainly virtualization focused in this room. The storage guys are arguing NFS, versus iSCSI versus Fiber Channel versus vSAN versus whatever. And the higher level management discussion is, how do we become more agile? How do we add elasticity via agility? Or agility versus elasticity? And how do we add scale? And I talked about that this isn't a question of cost. Outsourcing isn't a question of cost. You're going to spend just as much, if not more money on outsourcing than you will on having full-time employees. It's about ultimately the end value you offer to the business. So Netflix has just fast-forwarded it to, I think, the future and said, you know what, we can have full-time employees. We don't have a problem with it. But they are not treated as these long-term these long-term assets that we're going to have forever. They are going to offer a distinct business value, and at the end of that business value, it was a great relationship. Thanks. Maybe in the future we'll have something for you, but for now, that's it. It's important for you guys to take the technologies that Scott looked at. Today we talked specifically about cloud native. We can expand the conversation well beyond cloud native into other avenues such as service management. Orchestration in general is just a conversation, I think, outside of cloud native. We crammed it into the cloud native conversation. But we can take these and apply it across the board. It's critical that you guys, I think, look at the overall arc of your career. Take the technologies that Scott presented earlier. I think they are very relevant to the virtualization stack. Investigate it, understand how those individual things add value to your business, as Scott talked about. A quick practical, do a brown bag on one of the technologies. At work, after you've learned something, do a brown bag, see who comes. Invite your boss. If your boss looks at it and comes, that's important. If your boss looks at it and doesn't come, I did one for OpenStack. I had 2 people show up. I did one on Cloud Native, 20 showed up. That showed me where the importance lied. Just a practical tip. That's all I have. Anybody have any questions?